Okay, let's do this. Hey, thanks for joining me today. I got a couple items that I want to talk through with you today because a lot of people don't necessarily know that today is Armed Forces Day. So, if you are in the armed forces, happy Armed Forces Day. What is Armed Forces Day? Because a lot of people aren't even necessarily aware that this is a thing. And dare I say, many people who are in the military may not even necessarily know that today is Armed Forces Day, because Armed Forces Day is separate and distinct from Memorial Day, but also separate and distinct from Veterans Day. So, Armed Forces Day, we celebrate those who are currently serving in uniform. Veterans Day is when we celebrate those who have served in uniform. Memorial Day, of course, the most solemn of these um, types of commemorative days, is when we honor those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. So, all right, today is Armed Forces Day. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, Armed Forces Day is celebrated on the third Saturday of May. May is known as Military Appreciation Month. A lot of people don't necessarily know that. It doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention, but May is Military Appreciation Month. And in fact, there's a week within May that is known as Armed Forces Week. But today, the third Saturday of May, is Armed Forces Day, which of course this year falls on the 17th. Today is the 17th. Okay, great. Um, so when exactly did Armed Forces Day become a holiday? So this actually goes all the way back to the National Security Act of 1947. Now, 1947 is a pretty pivotal year in U.S. history, and I would say, um, kind of in what would be, I would say it's kind of a watershed year in the construction of the military-industrial complex, and a lot of it has to do with the National Security Act. So the National Security Act did a couple of things. So one of the things that it did was it consolidated the branches, the various service branches of the military into what would become known as the Department of Defense. That, today we call it the Department of Defense. Another thing that the National Security Act did was it actually created an independent Air Force. So before that, aviation had already existed for a while, obviously. I mean, there were, aviation existed in World War II in 1947. We were only a couple of years removed from World War II. But even as far back as, World War I, there were aviation units, etc. So previously, that had all been part of the Army. And one of the things that the National Security Act did was it created an independent branch of the Air Force. The other thing that the National Security Act did was it created the CIA. Anyway, today what we're talking about, though, is something else. You have the creation of DOD as part of the National Security Act in 1947. A short time later, in 1949, the gentleman who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, Lewis Johnson, announced the creation of Armed Forces Day. And then it was celebrated for the first time the following May. So this would have been May of 1950. And that year it fell on the 20th. So on May 20th, 1950, under President Truman's direction, Armed Forces Day was celebrated for the first time. And since then, it has continued to be celebrated on the third Saturday of each month. So here's what we're going to do. You might ask, okay, well, has the current president said anything about Armed Forces Day? And the answer is yes, he has. So um, let's look at the proclamation for Armed Forces Day 2025, because yes, there is one. All right, so I will provide a link to this, but you should be able to see this here. So this is just obviously from, the White House's page. It says here, Armed Forces Day 2025. This is very short. We'll go through it. So it's dated with yesterday's date. So it probably came out last night or whatever, but obviously today is Armed Forces Day because today is Saturday. So what does it say? By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. On Armed Forces Day, we pause to honor the men and women of America's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Space Force. Every day, throughout our homeland and in far-flung regions of the world, our fighting forces valiantly safeguard our liberty, defend our border, and support global stability through humanitarian missions and disaster relief operations. In America's legacy of awe-inspiring heroes, they are without equal. Okay, all right. I mean, nice enough. I mean, this is just the president in his capacity as president, therefore, of course, commander in chief. He is just putting out a proclamation about Armed Forces Day and the importance of our armed forces. All right. So let's read on. As commander in chief, my highest responsibility is to ensure our all volunteer military, 2.1 million strong, is the world's most lethal fighting force. I have taken bold steps to prioritize military excellence and readiness across every branch of service, ensuring that all active duty, National Guard, and reserve members who wear our nation's uniform are prepared to deploy, fight, and win against any adversary in any domain. America's military will soon be stronger and more powerful than ever before. Since November, enlistment numbers for every branch of the armed forces have surged. Recruitment is now the highest it has been in 30 years. Okay, so this is a great pitch. Is it true? I don't know that it's not, so I'm certainly not going to say that it is not true. I do believe that recruitment probably is going up. I mean, I've heard the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, talk about the Trump bump, that recruitment numbers are rising because people want to serve under President Trump. Is that true? I don't know that it isn't. Now, I haven't looked at the specific numbers, so I don't necessarily know what they look like, but I do believe that recruitment is probably rising, and maybe even sharply. Is that a good thing? I don't know. Remains to be seen. Let's talk about it here in a moment, but let's continue reading. On Armed Forces Day, we celebrate those for whom patriotism is not a passive duty, lofty ideal, but a way of life that is measured by the unyielding commitment to serve this nation with valor, vigilance, integrity, and devotion to duty. It is worthy not only of a day of recognition, but also a lifetime of respect from a grateful nation. Now, this is well written. I mean, it's very nice. It's a little bit flowery, but that's what you would expect from a proclamation like this. I don't have any problem with that. And some of this is quite well worded. We celebrate those for whom patriotism is not a passive, lofty ideal. I mean, that's true. There are a lot of people who are, they're patriots, but they're patriots that are sitting on the couch. Obviously, you don't have the luxury of doing that when you serve in the military. You have to back up your patriotism with action. And a lot of times that action may require you to deploy to, faraway lands and make certain sacrifices, to include potentially the ultimate sacrifice. Okay, let's keep reading. The First Lady joins me in saluting our service members on land, at sea, and in air and space, along with their devoted families who share in this legacy of service and sacrifice. Now, therefore, I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States, continuing the tradition of my predecessors in office, do hereby proclaim the third Saturday of each May as Armed Forces Day. I invite the governors of the states and territories and other areas subject to the jurisdiction of the United States to provide for the observance of Armed Forces Day within their jurisdiction in an appropriate manner designed to increase public understanding and appreciation of our armed forces. I call upon all Americans to display the flag of the United States at their homes and businesses on Armed Forces Day. And I urge citizens to learn more about military service by attending and participating in the local observances of the day. Proclamation 10762 of May 17th, 2024 is hereby superseded. Now, when he mentions that previous proclamation, I think that's just the proclamation from last year of last year's Armed Forces Day. He's merely saying, hey, that is superseded by this year's proclamation. I think that's all that means. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand this 16th day of May in the year of our Lord 2025, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 249th. Donald J. Trump. Okay, so that's about what you would expect from a presidential proclamation having to do with Armed Forces Day. Very nicely worded, a little bit flowery, but that's again what you're going to expect from the president. I think for the most part, it's an appropriate message. I think it's proper. I don't necessarily have anything against the proclamation. I just wanted to share that with you guys. Now, I do think there are some things mentioned in there that we can talk about. We can talk about patriotism. We can talk about recruitment. He also says, he calls upon the public, the citizenry, to learn more about military service or to engage in celebrating the day or honoring our service members. So, what do we think of that? Is there anything wrong with that? Well, of course, no, there's nothing wrong with honoring service members. There's certainly nothing wrong with honoring the fact that we have a military or that we have a body of people who are trained and are prepared to defend the nation. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I think those things are necessary and appropriate. And I would kind of be a hypocrite if I thought otherwise, since I spent a long time in the military. So, recruitment. So is the fact that recruitment may be rising, and I'm just going to assume that it is. I haven't looked at the numbers, so let's just assume that it is. Is that a good thing? Well, I mean, it could be. Again, it's one thing to have a military that exists to defend the nation. That idea in the abstract, I think, is a good idea. But what is it that our military is doing? That's where it's maybe important for us to kind of, understand, all right, why do we have a military? Why exactly does it exist, etc. So let's read a book. Let's read a little bit here in this book. So this book is called, I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to put this up here just where you can see the title if anyone's interested. All right. So the book is called For Liberty and the Republic. The subtitle is The American Citizen as Soldier, 1775 to 1861. Now, the author is Ricardo A. Herrera, who is actually a professor that I had when I was at the School of Advanced Military Studies. And he's a historian. So I'm just going to read just a couple of things here, not too much, but just a couple ideas. So again, the book is called For Liberty and the Republic, The American Citizen as Soldier. So just think about that. So think about the link between being a citizen and a soldier. All right. And I'm just with no preamble here. I'm just going to start reading a couple lines here. From 1775 to 1861, the American Army was an awkward amalgam of the small regular army, the state's militias, and in wartime, a mass of volunteers. This mixture, although complex and frequently cumbersome in practice, accorded well with the beliefs and needs of the American citizenry. Classical, Commonwealth, and American Republican tradition equated citizenship with soldiering. Now, I should not have to explain this, but just in case I do, when it mentions here the American Republic tradition, that of course is Republican with a lowercase r. That has nothing to do with the political party. It has to do with the fact that we live in a republic and what that means. Okay. The experience of the War for Independence had taught many Americans that a small regular army was valuable, and that by restricting and securing its loyalty to the nation and its people, the Army's existence might be reconciled with Republican society and government. Now, this is interesting because remember, so the Constitution, of course, grants for the creation and even the funding of an army, also, maintaining a navy, etc. But there were people in the early founding period that were wary of large standing armies, right? And that is not what our army was that won the War for Independence. But let's keep reading. Patterns of thought and behavior within the ethos were not, therefore, exclusive military traits. but were characteristic of the larger patterns within American political culture. So pervasive was the military ethos of republicanism that American soldiers, whether regulars, volunteers, or militiamen, believed themselves to be citizens first and foremost. Let's keep reading. War was a signal ingredient in Americans' creation of a national identity, and it played a formative role in helping them define and understand what they saw as their national character. Indeed, because war was a recurrent, almost endemic element in early American history, it could not help but be a fundamental component in the construction of national identity. And I would add here that war continues to be a fundamental pillar of our national identity. Whether it's good or bad, of course, we could debate. I would argue that it's both, but it was certainly a founding characteristic of our culture in the early days of the Republic, and continues to be so for reasons that are, I would say, somewhat more nefarious in recent decades. The experience of war and military service was something shared between soldiers from different states and regions, and it often transcended differences among Americans, helping them conceive of themselves as a people, however imperfectly. All right. So, I mean, that's interesting, especially when you think of what the early American army looked like compared to the British regulars, right? And we even spoke a little bit about that in my video on Paul Revere's Ride. Anyway, so I'm going to read very briefly from this book. So this book is called For the Common Defense. Okay, it's a huge book. A little bit dry. I mean, it's kind of like a textbook. I mean, this thing is thick. So if you're I can't remember exactly when I got this book, but I know that this book was considered to be um in various courses that I took when I was a major in the Army. This was considered to be a text, or it was considered to be a book that you were supposed to have some understanding of and familiarity with, almost as like a prerequisite for the course. Because I do remember reading through this quite a bit before I went to the School of Advanced Military Studies. Um, anyway, but that aside, so there's just something I want to read here briefly from the introduction. Okay, so this book is basically about military history. So let me just read this and then let me explain why I'm reading it. So this is from the introduction. So this book is called For the Common Defense, A Military History of the United States from 1607 to 2012. 6 major themes place United States military history within the broad context of American history. And I'm going to stop right there because I don't, for all the reasons we just talked about, in reading the other book, right? You can't talk about American history to any real degree without understanding military history, because it's such a significant component of our nation's history. All right. 6 major themes place United States military history within the broad context of American history. 6, we're going to talk about these 6 themes. We're going to read through them quickly. First, rational military considerations alone have rarely shaped military policies and programs. So that means that it wasn't just the cold military calculus that would ultimately determine military policy. More would go into it. Second, American defense policy has traditionally been built upon pluralistic military institutions, most noticeably a mixed force of professionals and citizen soldiers. All right, this kind of goes back to what we just spoke about in reading some from the other book. Third, this is very important. Despite the popular belief that the United States has generally been unprepared for war, policymakers have done remarkably well in preserving the nation's security. Okay, is that true? If so, why is that? What exactly does that mean for the rise of the military industrial complex? What does it mean now? Those are things to consider. Fourth, the nation's firm commitment to civilian control of military policy requires careful attention to civil military relations. Now, that's a key one because if you're listening to this and you have no tie whatsoever to the military, you have not served, you don't necessarily have any close friends or family that have served, what does the military have to do with you? What's the connection? Does it matter? And I would say yes, particularly in a country like the United States where the influence the military has on wider society is so vast. So again, the nation's firm commitment to civilian control of military policy requires careful attention to civil military relations. Okay, so that was 4. So number 5. The armed forces have become progressively more nationalized and professionalized. Well, what does it mean for the military to become professionalized? What does it mean for military service members to be professionals? Or for what is the profession of arms? Why is it considered to be a profession? What does that mean that it's a profession? And then number 6, beginning in the mid-19th century, but especially during the 20th century, industrialization has shaped the way the nation has fought. Okay, well, what does that mean? I've already mentioned the military-industrial complex a couple times now. And I've said before, and I'll say again here, that when you think about the military-industrial complex now, it's not so much about hardware, though I mean, clearly this is still important. Fighter aircraft, submarines, tanks, advanced weaponry, of course, that's still important. But what about AI? Or what about, other AI enhanced systems or other tools that are more digital in nature? What about that? And there's also a huge connection between the hardware and a lot of the digital enhancement of that hardware too. So that's an important part of what's going on with the military industrial complex now. So what exactly does this mean? What's the purpose of our military? And is our military still serving in line with that original purpose? So let's read something else here. Let me pull this up. Okay, cool. What do I have here? ADP 1, the Army. What does that mean? Okay, so ADP stands for, so let me go back up here and show you this. Okay. So what is this? So this is just a doctrinal publication. That's what this is. This one is called the Army. So it is a capstone document that basically explains some of the fundamental ideas that go into the way in which the Army operates. Now, what I'm going to read here, I'm going to read from this Army manual just a couple of things, but just understand that this applies across the military as a whole, not just the Army specifically, even though I happen to be reading from an Army doctrinal publication. Also, just please note here, so this is from July 2019, but I still believe that this is the one that is the most recent. But if it's not, things probably have not changed so greatly that what we're going to talk about no longer applies. Also, please note here that this is approved for public release. The distribution is unlimited. There's nothing classified about this document at all. All right, so we're going to skip through this, but there are a couple of things I want to share with you guys. Okay, we're in the introduction. This is what I want to get to. So we're in the introduction. So this is called the guiding foundations. And this is, I think it's going to call it a logic chart. Yeah, guiding foundations logic chart, right? So the only thing that I want to show you here is when we talk about the guiding foundations for where the Army derives its doctrine, let's look at the starting point. So what is this? So the starting point is law. Well, what's the supreme law of the land? The Constitution. Okay. And then you've got Title 10 United States Code. Then you've got, DOD directorates. So directives that are coming from the Department of Defense. But all of our doctrine is fundamentally nested in law, first and foremost, the Constitution. And then out of that, you have the various levels of strategy. So security strategy, the defense strategy, the military strategy, et cetera. We don't have to necessarily go into that in a ton of detail here. That's not necessarily my purpose, but I did just want to share with you that military doctrine, regardless of whether it's Army, Navy, it doesn't matter. It is going to be grounded in law. And if it's grounded in law, first and foremost, it has to be grounded in the Constitution. Okay. And this logic chart explains that. And then from there, you get the various strategies. From the strategies, you get national military objectives. And then from there, you get what it is that the Army actually does. And then there's doctrine that the Army follows in order to execute its role. Okay, so why America needs an army? Okay, so interestingly enough, and this is kind of funny, but I also understand the reason behind it. So here's chapter 1. Okay, we're going to open up here with a statement from an Air Force Chief of Staff. So what does General Welsh III say? You don't dictate end states from the air. You can't control territory. You can't influence people. You can't maintain lines of control after you've established them. That will take a ground force. So this is an Air Force Chief of Staff actually extolling the virtues of the Army. The Army took this guy's statement and, slapped it on here. I don't know how he felt about that, but anyway. So let's just read this first paragraph here. The nation's need for a capable, ready army is enduring, even if it has not always been a priority. During important moments in our nation's history, such as the beginning of World War II and the Korean War, ill-prepared army forces sacrificed at great cost to buy time while the nation went through the deliberate and time-consuming process of properly organizing, equipping, and training sufficient ground forces. The first battles ended badly. U.S. Army forces in the Philippines and Korea suffered painful defeats, in large part because they were not prepared for war. While soldiers fought valiantly in both places, they were not ready for combat. Given the lessons of our own history and that large-scale ground combat against a peer threat is no longer unthinkable, it is our moral imperative to ensure that we send no soldiers into combat unless they are properly equipped, trained, and led. Let's stop right there. Okay. So what does this have to do with the government, and what does it have to do with the citizenry? So what this says here is, hey, there have been times in our nation's history in which we have sent soldiers into combat and they weren't necessarily prepared to be there. And it was a time-consuming process of properly organizing, equipping, and training sufficient ground forces. Okay, it goes on to mention large-scale ground combat against a peer threat is no longer unthinkable. So large-scale ground combat, what is that? So large-scale ground combat is exactly what it sounds like. So this is a clash in combat of forces that are very large and that are operating or maneuvering in very large formations, okay? As opposed to a lot of what we have seen the last couple of decades with the global war on terror, where you would have patrols or smaller units that might be going out and conducting relatively smaller scale operations. And if they were to run into some sort of resistance, this resistance was not from a regular uniformed military unit, but a group of, military age males or whatever, and you would hear the term, insurgents or whatever, but not a regular trained military force with, proper military equipment and operating using some sort of professionally learned tactics. And that's not to say that there weren't highly skilled fighters in Afghanistan and Iraq that our troops would come across. Sometimes they were. I mean, in some of these places, you do have individuals who are very skilled fighters. That's not necessarily my point. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were professionally trained soldiers that are part of a recognized, military unit. Now think about the scale of World War II, where you had divisions, and in some cases, even larger, in some cases, much larger echelons that were moving and participating in these enormous operations, that would last for quite a while. So that is large scale ground combat as opposed to what we've seen the last couple of decades. So what is this saying? Hey, we have to prepare for potential large scale ground combat once again. And we got to make sure that our military is prepared for that. That's what this is saying here. Okay. Now, what is a peer threat? So when we say here, given the lessons of our own history and that large scale ground combat against a peer threat is no longer unthinkable, what's a peer threat? So a peer threat is a nation who has a military that is at least comparable in terms of size and prowess as ours. So this would be China, Russia, or some other, large scale power like that. It's not what we were facing in Iraq or Afghanistan, et cetera. Okay. I don't know that there's necessarily anything else that we need to talk about here. I just wanted to mention some of those opening words from that document. So again, that was ADP, which is a doctrinal publication from the Army. And it is kind of considered to be the doctrinal foundation from which the rest of the doctrine flows. So that's why it's ADP 1. So what I want to go to now, though, so let's keep in mind everything that we've read, and let's think about what we as the citizens, is there a responsibility that rests on our shoulders to ensure that our military is prepared in the event that our military has to go to war in order to defend the nation? Is there a responsibility that rests on our shoulders? And if so, what is that responsibility? So let's keep that in mind as we continue to move forward. Let's also think about what exactly does it mean to support the troops? So this idea of supporting the troops is something that has been around for a long time. The yellow ribbon, sending care packages to service members abroad, or offering some other support to service members. What exactly does it mean to support the troops? Is it more than that? Does it mean, how do we necessarily separate between supporting troops who might be sent into combat situations and ensuring that they're prepared if that happens, and then maybe the policies that are sending them there? Is there a distinction between those two? Is that something we have to, wrestle with and try and figure out where the line between those two perhaps lies? I don't know, maybe, but it's something we should think about. So let's just keep that in mind as we read what I want to share next. Okay, so this is ADP 622. So this is another Army doctrinal publication. It's called Army Leadership and the Profession. So this is from July 2019, which is the same month as the other one. But there's actually, this one also includes a change that was published a couple of months later in November of 2019 that is included in this edition that I'm showing you. So you'll see here, so it's actually dated 25 November 2019 rather than the July 2019 you saw on the cover, because it has some changes. This publication has changed to incorporate a couple of things. And then it mentions here where throughout the document it denotes what is a change. So this happens with these doctrinal publications. This is not a big deal, but a new edition will come out, and then it will, closely thereafter, it'll be published with a change to that edition. So it's not a whole new edition, but it's a change to the edition that was just published. So that's all that means. Not a big deal. So, and in fact, you'll actually note here ADP 622, comma C1. That means change 1. And you'll see that it's dated November 2019 rather than July 2019. All right, but whatever, no big deal. So let's go through, because we're going to talk about some important stuff here in the beginning that I think will help you understand why I wanted to share this with you today. Okay, introduction. ADP 622, that's this document, establishes and describes the Army profession and the associated ethic that serves as the basis for a shared professional identity. It establishes and describes what leaders should be and do. An ideal Army leader serves as a role model through strong intellect, physical presence, professional competence, and moral character. All right. So, and I'm gonna read that again in a moment, but let me just pause and let me just say, I'm sharing with you an Army document, but the same thing would be expected if you were in the Marines or the Air Force or wherever. So don't think that this wording is specific to the Army. I get that. But the same things would be required of leaders in the other services too. Listen, am I a little bit biased because I came out of the Army? Yeah, sure. But it's not like the other service branches are going to let you get away with being a weak leader. Okay, so let's read this again. But the reason that I'm sharing that is because I want you to understand I'm familiar with these documents because I came out of the Army. So I know where to find this stuff. My assumption is that similar, ideas are expressed in the doctrinal publications from the other document or from the other services. Okay, so let's read this again. An ideal Army leader serves as a role model through strong intellect, physical presence, professional competence, and moral character. An Army leader is able and willing to act decisively within superior leaders' intent and purpose and in the organization's best interests. Army leaders recognize that organizations built on mutual trust and confidence accomplish missions. Okay. Great. I agree with all that. The question that I have is that what our Army expects of our leaders? It should be. I agree with the language. I agree with the ideals communicated here. But in practice, is that what our Army expects of its leaders? Is that what the Army's actions over the last couple of years would lead us to believe? All right. So, I'll give you the links where you can find these documents if you really wanted to go through and read this. You could find this, but we're just going to read some stuff here in chapter 1. The Army profession, ethic, and leadership. For more than 240 years, the United States Army has protected the people and interests of the nation. The Army is not alone. The Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, government agencies, and local law enforcement and firefighters all perform similar services to the nation and in its communities. All right, we got a quotation down here from General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. The soldier, above all other people, prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. That's from a very famous speech that he gave in 1962 at West Point. And I have actually quoted from that speech in I quoted from that speech in a piece that I wrote on my Substack about West Point. All right, the Army profession and ethic. War is a lethal clash of wills and an inherently human endeavor that requires perseverance, sacrifice, and tenacity. The United States Army's primary reason for existence is to deploy, fight, and win the nation's wars by providing ready, prompt, and sustained land dominance by Army forces across the range of military operations as part of the joint force. Okay, let's read that again. War is a lethal clash of wills and an inherently human endeavor that requires perseverance, sacrifice, and tenacity. True. The United States Army's primary reason for existence is to deploy, fight, and win the nation's wars by providing ready, prompt, and sustained land dominance by Army forces across the range of military operations as part of the joint force. True. Okay, why does the Army exist? To deploy, fight, and win the nation's wars. How? By providing ready, prompt, and sustained land dominance by Army forces. Why land? Because the Army fights on land. As part of the joint force. So the Army is part of the joint force, joint along with, the Navy, the Air Force, etc. All the service branches make up the joint force. Enduring the physical hardship, danger, and uncertainty of combat requires an Army that is professionally committed and guided by an ethic that motivates and guides its forces in the conduct of missions, performance of duty, and all aspects of life. The Army profession. The character of the Army as an institution and a profession are both essential to accomplishing the Army's mission. However, it is the American people's trust and confidence in the Army as an ethical profession that grants it the autonomy to exercise the disciplined initiative critical to accomplishing missions under diverse conditions around the world. It is the American people's trust and confidence in the Army as an ethical profession that grants it the autonomy to exercise the disciplined initiative critical to accomplishing missions under diverse conditions around the world. Do you out there listening to this, do you have trust and confidence in the Army? I do not. I do not. There are many great people in the Army. There are also many senior leaders in the Army that are perfectly willing to turn their backs on the Constitution that they have taken an oath to. There are plenty of senior leaders in the Army and the other service branches that will turn their backs on the American people. How do we know that? Because they did it. So I believe these ideals that are being communicated here. I do not believe that senior leaders in the Army, even mid-grade leaders in the Army, abide by these ideals. And I'm not saying that because I require perfection. That's not what I'm saying. Just good general alignment with these ideals would be great. I don't think it's too much to ask from those who purport to defend the nation. But let's continue. Let's go on down here. Okay, the Army ethic. True professions are guided by an ethic that establishes the personal and institutional standards expected of its members. A professional ethic creates a shared professional identity and provides an enduring set of moral principles, values, and beliefs that guide that profession as it provides its specialized service to society. The Army ethic, it's in bold lettering here. The Army ethic is the set of enduring moral principles, values, beliefs, and laws that guide the Army profession and create the culture of trust essential to Army professionals in the conduct of missions, performance of duty, and all aspects of life. The Army ethic is the set of enduring moral principles, enduring moral principles. We don't suspend these moral principles. enduring moral principles, values, beliefs, and laws that guide the Army profession and create the culture of trust essential to Army professionals. Laws, enduring moral principles, values, beliefs, and laws. This has to be nested in law for reasons that I mentioned when we looked at ADP 1. You know, the Constitution is the foundation of this ethic and our doctrine. Let's keep reading. The Army ethic is the basis of the Army's shared professional identity of trusted Army professionals. The identity expresses how Army professionals view their profession and why they serve. Love of country and family, preservation of the peace, and defense of the American people and the Army values are inherent to the Army ethic. The ethical, effective, and efficient accomplishment of the mission is the core of this ethic. Soldiers and Army civilians, the Army does employ a lot of civilians, are bound in common moral purpose to support and defend the Constitution and the American people. Soldiers and Army civilians are bound in common moral purpose to support and defend the Constitution and the American people. Then why did so many leaders in the Army over the last couple of years turn their backs on both the Constitution and the American people? Why did they break the law? Why were they so willing to desecrate the uniform that they proudly wore as they turned their backs on the Constitution and the American people? And you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the COVID op. I will not shut up about this. I will not shut up about this because these problems have not been adequately addressed. Sure, the Department of Defense is pretending to address them, but none of the most fundamental problems have been addressed. And that's before we even talk about the treason that was the militarized response known as Warp Speed. Remember, executed by the Department of Defense as a military countermeasure. What we have witnessed the last couple of years was a military operation. A military operation. And it's not the first time. After the treasonous operation known as 9/11, or that occurred on 9/11, where was the military? Was the military standing up for the Constitution? Or did the military go right along with these illegal wars that were based on lies? And I have to say, many of the senior most military officials, they knew what they were doing in the immediate wake of 9/11. They knew what they were doing. They knew what had happened, in my opinion. You know, can I prove that? No. But I'll tell you this. If they didn't know what was going on, at some point, they probably woke up to it. How come none of them said anything? How come none of them said anything during COVID? At what point are people going to realize that our government is the problem? And that one of the foremost pillars of the treason being conducted against us is being perpetrated at the hands of those who wear the military uniform. No, this doesn't mean that every single person serving in the military is committing treason. That's not what I'm saying. But as an institution, they have played a fundamental role in the ongoing treason in this country for decades. And I am convinced many of them have done so willingly. They have been willingly complicit. They have played an active role in that treason. They turned their backs on the Constitution. They set themselves in direct opposition to the values that the institution purports to care about. And many of them, I'm convinced, did so knowingly. Let's continue. The Army ethic guides institutional policy and practice in the ethical design, generation, support, and application of land power under civilian authority on behalf of the American people. The relationship between the Army profession and the American people depends on mutual trust, continuously reinforced through the performance of honorable service, military expertise, and stewardship. Stewardship. Where are these stewards? Show me a general officer or a flag officer that has been a genuine steward of the resources and the personnel committed to their charge over the last couple of years. Show me one. Show me one, and I will show you someone who kept their mouth shut and was complicit in everything that happened over the last couple of years that resulted in how many dead Americans, to include service members, and how many other injured service members, how many other ruined careers of service members, a desecration of the readiness of the force, an eradication of the trust between the institution charged with defending the nation and the people that it is supposed to defend. Show me one general or admiral that you think has been a genuine steward, and I will show you a coward. The Army ethic has its origins in the philosophical heritage, theological and cultural traditions, and the historical legacy that frame our nation. Now, I talk about this all the time. I did a video just a couple of days ago where I talked about, when you look at the law doesn't just exist independent of other underpinnings, right? Many of which are cultural, but there's a political philosophy behind our legal framework. And behind that political philosophy, there are theological assumptions. This is absolutely correct. I agree with this. The Army ethic has its origins in the philosophical heritage, theological and cultural traditions, and the historical legacy that frame our nation. We spoke about some of that. We read through some of that. Understanding the connection between being a citizen and a soldier, understanding what it means to don the military uniform in a republic. And here's what it means to live in a republic. It means you do not have the luxury of sitting on the couch and expecting people to keep you free. When you live in a republic, it means that you have a responsibility on your shoulders to ensure that your nation remains free. It means that there is something expected of the people. There are a lot of people who sure claim to love freedom until it's time to do something to keep it. And then the next thing you know what they do? They look for somebody else to do the hard work. So let's keep going on and let's finish this up here. Okay, so I got two more things I want to read. So the Army values. The Army values embody the practical application of the Army ethic. They encompass the enduring moral principles, beliefs, and laws that guide Army professionals in accomplishing the mission, as well as their conduct in all aspects of life. The Army values are loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. And it gives a definition of each of these. The Army values are loyalty, bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, the Army, your unit, and other soldiers. How many people over the last couple of years violated that, showed that they could not express their loyalty to the Constitution, or even really to the Army or their unit? Duty, fulfill your obligations. What about your obligation to disobey an unlawful order? What about your obligation to the Constitution or your country? Respect, treat people as they should be treated. Well, that was also thrown out the window by many senior and mid-grade leaders across the Army and the other services the last couple of years. The unlawful coercion, the almost blanket denials of accommodation requests, whether they be religious or medical. to not take the COVID shot. There are innumerable instances of failures to treat people with respect over the last couple of years. Selfless service, don't even get me started. Defined as put the welfare of the nation, the army, and your subordinates before your own. How many of these weak-kneed generals put themselves and their careers before the Constitution, the nation, the readiness of their units? Cowards. Cowards. Honor. Live up to the Army values. If any of these generals had any honor whatsoever, they would resign. They would resign, they would take the uniform off, and they would leave the service. They don't do that because they have no honor. Integrity. Do what is right legally and morally. I mean, I feel like I don't even need to say anything about integrity. I mean, the Army is a service that has pushed out those who had integrity and has rewarded those who have shown that their integrity is conditional. That's exactly what the Army has done. The other service branches have been no better. They have rewarded those who show that integrity is conditional. Personal courage. Face fear, danger, or adversity. Our military rewards cowardice. Moral cowardice. I've spoken before at length about the idea of moral injury. I've written on it at my Substack. You can go find it there. Our military and our nation continue to be morally injured. Okay. I want to end here with the oaths. So this is oath for enlisted members and the oath for officers. All right, I'm just going to read these. We'll quickly note some distinctions between them, but I also want to focus on the similarities. Oath of enlistment. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me, according to regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice, so help me God. So in this one, the oath that enlisted, members of the Army or service members would take, okay, they do swear that they will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution. And then they also have a clause here that says that they will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed above them, so superior officers, right? There is a hierarchy in the military. Everyone already knows that. The President is the commander-in-chief. It does not mention a president by name here. This is not allegiance to a specific man. This is allegiance to an individual occupying the office of President of the United States and therefore Commander-in-Chief. Now, if you saw the last video that I did, I talked about how there was the change in the oath that the German armed services were taking. And they went from taking an oath that looked kind of like this to taking an oath in which they expressed their loyalty to Adolf Hitler, the man. All right. Oath of office for commissioned officers and DA civilians. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. So what are the similarities between the enlisted oath and the oath for officers? First and foremost, both oaths have the same language when it comes to supporting and defending the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Bearing true faith and allegiance to that Constitution. That language is the same for both oaths. You're in the military. You will support and defend the Constitution. Otherwise, why are you wearing the uniform? Or the enlisted, it specifies they will obey the orders of their superior officers, to include the president as commander-in-chief. Why? Because that is required under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Does that mean that officers don't obey the orders of their superiors? No, so long as those orders are lawful, of course. But let's talk about this that's in the officer oath. I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I'm about to enter. What I would say to these senior leaders and plenty of mid-grade leaders across the military, why did you turn your back on this oath? And it's not just that you refused to support and defend the Constitution, even though you swore an oath that you would do so. You swore an oath that you would bear true faith and allegiance to that Constitution, and you refused to do so. But your inability to abide by your oath does not end there. What about the part where it says you take the obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion? Did you mean when you took this oath to evade the responsibilities and the obligations that are contained herein? Did you take the oath with a purpose to evade? If you didn't, then why did you do it? Why did you turn your back on the Constitution? Why did you turn your back on the American people? You swore an oath that you would well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office. Why did you refuse to do so? So what does this mean for us? What does this mean for us? What are we to make of all of this? Here is my point. Happy Armed Forces Day to those who are serving. I am proud to be a West Point graduate. I'm proud to have spent 19 years in the Army. I am proud of the time that I spent in uniform. I'm proud of the things that I accomplished. However, I am most proud of the fact that when the time came for me to make a tough decision and to either comply with the oath of office that I took, which I just read to you, or protect my job, protect my pension, I sided with the Constitution and the American people. And I have never regretted that decision. And if I had it to do all over again, I would do the exact same thing. That's what I am most proud of. So do I support our military? Yes. Do I believe in supporting the troops? Yes. However, let's make sure we understand what exactly that means. There are troops out there, because troop can be broadly defined. There are some great people in the military. I'm friends with many of them. I am friends with people that I think made some cowardly decisions, and I have told them. Still my friends. Maybe we haven't talked much the last couple of years. I still consider them friends. But I do believe that they shirked their responsibilities. And I do believe that they committed cowardly acts in which I do believe that they desecrated the uniform. I believe they shirked their responsibilities. And I do believe that they turned their backs on the Constitution and the American people. And I do believe that there are more senior individuals in the military that are guilty of crimes. And I believe they should be held accountable. And I believe that some individuals in government have committed treason. That's what I believe. I'm certainly not the only one. And I've said that. I've been saying that for years. So for me, Supporting the troops is about supporting the individuals who, I don't believe in, spitting on service members just because we don't necessarily um, agree with policies that they had to carry out. However, service members are responsible for what it is that they do. Are there people right now that are serving in the military for good reasons? Yes, of course. That are doing so with genuine intent? Yes. And some of them I've been, collaborating with while they've been inside the military and I've been outside the military, and we have still been collaborating with one another, and they've been fighting from the inside and I've been fighting from the outside. I don't want to fight from the inside. I'm not looking to go back into the military. I think the institution's too far gone. I think that the changes that have to happen in the military and have to happen in the government for it to truly be corrected are I just don't see them happening anytime soon, because I don't see anybody addressing the most fundamental issues, or very, very few people are addressing the most fundamental issues. I shouldn't say nobody. So yeah, we should take a nuanced look at this. Support the troops. Should we support individuals who are trying to do the right thing and want to do the right thing? Yes. Should we support senior members of the military who have proven to be criminals and cowards? No, absolutely not. And in fact, those individuals aren't even supporting the rank and file members of the military. So what would I say to those who are currently in the military right now, or who are thinking about joining? You need to make decisions now as to what it means to serve. And you need to understand now and have the decision clear in your head as to what you will do if you find yourself in a situation where you are being directly called upon to either abide by the oath that you took or turn your back on it. Make the decision now. Because as an institution, the Department of Defense is not going to do the right thing. Sure, I understand there's this veneer that things are changing in the Department of Defense. That's all I think it is. If I'm wrong, great. I would love to be wrong. But that will be my position until reality shows that the changes that are occurring in DoD are truly substantive. And until they are, I'm going to assume that they are an illusion, because that's what I think. I don't see any evidence to make me think otherwise. So as Americans, as American citizens, we have responsibilities that lie on our shoulders. Because remember, we have responsibilities to make sure that the government abides by the law. And we, as a people, for too long have shirked that responsibility. And so to some degree, we're all complicit in how we got to where we are. And I made a video about that, about how to some degree we collectively are to blame. We've allowed ourselves to get where we are. And we can fix this if enough Americans would wake up. And the reason that I focus so much on the military, even if you're not in the military and you're not even interested in the military, the issue is that when it comes to the military, I've said it so many times, what happens in the military is often an indicator of what's going to happen in the nation or in society more broadly or at large. So it's important that you understand that. You got to keep an eye on what's going on in the military. The other thing is I don't want our service members to be abused. I don't want our service members to continue to be morally injured. Many of them are good people, and I support them. I do support the troops. And in my mind, and this goes back to what I said earlier, I can draw the distinction between the service members and errant, and in many cases, unconstitutional policies that employ those service members in a way that I don't think they should be employed in. But we need more people in uniform to find their balls, find their courage, and find a copy of the Constitution and start reading it. So thanks for hanging in there with me. I know I got a little bit passionate today, but this is important. Our country is in crisis. And if you think that it's not because we've got a new president in, then you're not paying attention and you're part of the problem. So don't be part of the problem, be part of the solution. But in order to be part of the solution, you got to understand what the problem is. So if you're in the military, then happy Armed Forces Day. And what I would encourage you to do is make the decision now as to how you, regardless of the circumstances, will make good on the oath that you have entered into. Thank you and have a great day. Appreciate it.